Robin Hood's Bay, May 1817. Robin Hood's Bay welcomed Raaz Panchal with a breeze that carried the sharp scent of the sea up to the cliffs. On this pristine spring day, the sun beamed bright in cloudless blue skies. The wind whipped across the long grass, creating waves that rippled through the blades. Beyond the crooked lines of cottages and narrow alleyways, wildflowers dotted the hillsides with color, and sheep grazed over the rolling green in puffs of white like little clouds. The entire halcyon landscape was too perfect, and surely anything so charming was never to be believed. Of course, he could understand the appeal of such a hamlet. If one were enamored by both the picturesque and the sublime in equal measure, then yes, the marshy moors, the cliffs, and the sea presented a wonderland. Perhaps that explained why his father had been so fond of the place, though Roz, his younger brother, and his three younger sisters had never visited before, as obscure and out of the way as it was from their life in London. But his father and mother had loved rusticating at their cottage ornée as often as they could when they were newly married. The deed had gone missing several months ago, but his father died before it could be recovered. So his was a solitary sojourn in the countryside to regain possession of the deed and bring it back where it belonged, the Wednesbury estate, for both his parents. Ross had assured his mother he knew it had meant a great deal to his father to have the cottage deed within the Wednesbury estate again. And since the late Duke couldn't fulfill his wish before his death, Ross would honor him by doing it now. He led his mount Shandar up the final stretch of the long, steep hill on which the Wednesbury cottage perched. Ross had arrived ahead of the hack he'd paid to bring his luggage, but fortunately his steward had managed to track down a spare key, which Roz now had on his person. Where the original had disappeared to was a mystery, but not one he could solve at the moment. He had a much more concerning problem on his hands right now. Linens drying on a line outside, a buckskin gelding grazing, windows open to let the breeze in. Someone, it seemed, had been living here, possibly for a good while by the looks of it. Roz had not expected to find the cottage occupied when he arrived to assess the state of it, but perhaps this was nothing more than a simple misunderstanding. He would explain he was the Duke and that this property belonged with the Wednesbury estate. Once he had the deed, he'd send the poor confused chap on his way, with some silver perhaps, for added persuasion. With that plan in place, Roz dismounted and tied Shandar to the hitching post near the fence. He opened the front gate and ventured up the stone path. When he reached the door, he raised his hand and rapped sharply with the W-shaped brass knocker. After a long pause, the door opened a crack. A voice said, "Sorry, we're not interested in whatever wares you're selling." "I'm not selling anything," Roz said. But then he lost his words as the door opened all the way. The most beautiful woman Roz had ever laid eyes on stood before him. Her sable hair cascaded over one shoulder in loose waves. As she swept her hair back with one hand, Roz followed the line of those long fingers. The delicate skin at her wrist was gold, as warm as the whiskey amber glow in her irises. His eyes followed the natural path of her shoulder upward to assess the curve of her neck. And, despite his best intentions, his gaze dropped to the swell of her breasts as she stepped closer to him. Roz sucked in a sharp breath at her sudden nearness. He didn't want to have her so close. He didn't want to catch the scent of her, which he searched for with the ferocity of a hound hunting a fox. Would it be the fragrance of fresh country air? The bright zing of lemons and sunshine? Would she carry with her the clean softness of laundry, or lavender and soap? If he pressed his lips to the hollow of her throat and swiped his tongue there, would she have the sweetness of oranges, the spice of musk? Goddamned infernal whimsy. It plagued him, pushing him further on the path to fantasy. This woman was a stranger, for heaven's sake, living in his house. He should not want to know what her skin smelled like, much less tasted like, and yet he wanted it too much. The sudden rush of desire surging in his blood shocked Roz. He reflexively took a step backward to put more space between him and this mystifying woman. Roz tried to anchor himself to something else, anything other than the thought of dipping his head to the curve of her shoulder and inhaling the scent of her hair deep into his lungs before grazing her skin with his teeth. His eyes fixed on the nip of her waist. It was then that he was aware of the clothes she wore. A man's shirt altered expressly for her form, and buckskin breeches that clung to the curves of her hips and thighs. It took all his effort to drag his gaze back up to her face, and with a panicked start, he realized that she was studying him too. She scrutinized him with less subtlety than he did her, raking her intense gaze from his head down to his boots, and then back up again. Should he avert his eyes, raise an eyebrow, and ask if he passed muster? Did she like what she saw? Why did he want her to? That last question was the one that heated his face. The charms of women were not lost on him, but she should not have affected him as such. Roz was not the green lad of his youth. He'd been all over England, traversed the entire continent, in fact. Perhaps it had simply been too long since he'd last been with a woman. This might have been a convincing argument, if not for the stubborn refusal of his memory to furnish a single one of those encounters. He could not remember the last time, or indeed any of the times. In that moment, it seemed there was no one he had ever desired. Not like this, until now, until her. And he didn't even know her name. Nor was he able to ask, it seemed. Roz's words tangled on his tongue under her gaze, and for the first time in his 34 years, his thoughts staggered to a standstill. He held his breath, waiting for her to say something, do something. Finally, she smiled, apparently finished with her assessment. You'll do. The words flooded him with a sense of relief that warmed his blood, as if he had been basking in the sun's glow instead of her gaze. He should not care. Who was this stranger in his house, acting like she owned it? She took him by the wrist and slapped an apple into his palm. Follow me, she said, withdrawing her touch and leading him into the cottage. Surely he was addled by the bold contact of her skin against his. Instead of declaring who he was and telling her to leave right then and there, he did follow her inside. They walked through the immaculate front hall, which boasted a large vase of daisies and cornflowers on a round brass and rosewood side table, and came to the drawing room. Shh. The woman held one slender index finger against her rosy lips before they entered. He kept his footsteps light as they approached the boarded-up hearth. There was a small gap between two loose slats, and out of this opening came a distinct meow. A cat. She wanted his help to rescue her cat. So why was he holding an apple? Here, hold this, he said, giving the apple back to the woman before kneeling at the hearth to investigate. After a few moments, one golden eye peered out, and then a feline head materialized. The dapper black and white cat looked at Roz like Roz was disturbing his home as well as the woman's, and then he strutted out of the hearth as if he were wearing the finest tailcoat. Roz stood and the cat circled back. He rubbed against Roz's legs, weaving between them and purring, then sauntered from the room to find someplace else to nap in peace. I knew it, the woman beamed at him. I could tell Billy would like you. Why? But he didn't ask her that, because he had no idea why he again cared for her opinion. She explained anyway. You seem steady, observant, controlled. I think Billy trusts that in a man. Roz snorted at the flattery. She apparently trusted him too, enough to let him in without asking who he was first, a thought that reminded him. The entire reason he was here was to inform her of who he was. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could get a single word out, he was interrupted by a bleat from behind him. He turned back toward the drawing room entrance. Of course, a goat lived in his cottage too. Considering she had named her cat the Hindi word for cat, he took a guess at the creature's name. I suppose the apple is for our friend Buckery, then. Roz asked in a wry tone, watching her face as they both walked over to the stout black, white, and gray goat. He caught a flash of recognition and surprise in her whiskey amber eyes at the Gujarati word for goat. Yes, she said. Her relaxed manner returned. Will you help me lead Buckery back outside to graze? So she was controlled too. Interesting. Especially when combined with that effervescent optimism. Why not? Roz drawled. What else were dukes good for? Once they'd coaxed Buckery into the grass, she dusted the apple off on her breeches and reached her hand out to the goat. They do better with smaller pieces, Roz muttered. He pulled out a penknife and handkerchief from his trouser pocket. He unfolded the blade and wiped it on the handkerchief. Allow me. She handed him the apple, and he strived to ignore the warmth of her fingers yet again. He sliced off a small piece of the fruit and held it out for the goat. Here you are, Buckery. We'll need to find another name for you, though. It's a shame the lady couldn't do any better than goat. It's a placeholder, she said with a frown, taking the remainder of the apple from Roz and holding out her other hand for his knife. Something pensive filled her expression. I'm told he was quite the troublemaker, and the people trying to rid themselves of him didn't have the decency to give him any name at all. I haven't had much time to become better acquainted with the animals, but it was the least I could do to make sure the poor dear had a name from the start. And she wouldn't get more time, because she had to leave, of course. He was supposed to be telling her that, right now, in fact. And yet, he gave her his penknife to slice the rest of the apple for the goat.